I've said before how I became interested in the Highland Clearances. I'm going a long way back now. I'm going back to the 1950s. Oh dear, ancient history. Medieval England, you might say. No, I was there at the time, and very few people were prepared to write about the Highland Clearances. It was an embarrassing subject. Because, I mean, are you going to write to the Duke of Argyll and say, I've been reading about all the terrible things your predecessors did, clearing the Campbells out so as to make the dukedom even richer than it already was? And I don't know what kind of reply you'd have got. So it was not a topic which was broached very often. And so you got histories so-called of Scotland, and you would read the whole history of Scotland, and what it was a history of the lowlands. They might just mention vaguely afterwards, yes, well, after Culloden, all the clansfolk decided that they would make their fortune in New Zealand. And very little description about why they would make their fortune in New Zealand. So you had to try and imagine these Scottish Highlanders whose love of their homeland was one of the many central characteristics which everybody talked about, who apparently one day after breakfast they said to each other, I know, let's abandon all this and let's go and live in New Zealand, shall we? So everybody said, yes, splendid idea. So off they went. And that was more or less all the explanation you ever got. So when I came along, there was very little in the way of explanations in the 50s. Then I was actually working for a publisher in, 1963. I was reading The Bookseller, which is the publisher's weekly journal, and turning over the leaves, next week's Bookseller, and blow me, there was a whole one-page advert for a book on the Highland Clearances. I could hardly believe it. I felt like Robinson Crusoe, who'd been alone on his desert island for many years. Then walking along the beach one day, he suddenly saw a footprint, a naked footprint, and he knew he hadn't been on that part of the beach, so he knew that he was not alone. So this was my reaction. Somebody else has done it. So when I got home that night, I put a fresh piece of paper in my typewriter and wrote at the top, The Scottish Highland Clearances by Alwyn, and started writing. But then that was early in 1963 when the book was being advertised. It came out later that year, and naturally I grabbed a copy of it as soon as I could. And it was okay. It had, it talked about some of the dramatic incidents, but it didn't go very deeply, I thought, into the causes of it. But then, after then, he was the person who, as it were, broke through the breakwater and the tide came pouring through. And after that, anybody who wrote a history of Scotland would be expected at least to touch his cap in the direction of the Highland Clearances. And people like Smout and Devine and so forth, numbers of them, began to write about the Highland Clearances. So every word that anybody else wrote, I grabbed and consumed for my own entertainment. And then, of course, there's a chap called Eric Richards, who's a Welshman to start with, but he became a professor in Australia, in Adelaide, I think, and he wrote a series of books about the Highland Clearances. And he did a good job in collecting up some of the material I'd already seen, and occasionally I got a further little insight into it from him, but by and large he followed what was then becoming the established line about the Highland Clearances, because you must remember the people who carried out the Highland Clearances or their descendants are very often still there, still owning, and this is quite remarkable because you think after 200, 300 years they must have gone by now. But I went through all the landowners, all the references to landowners in the Highlands, and I wrote to every one of them, and I said I didn't want to start off on the wrong note, so I just put it, I am interested in the Highland Clearances, I'm thinking of writing a book, and I wonder if you could give me any help with the clearances in your neck of the woods. And I must have written to nearly 100 of them, and I didn't really, to be honest, expect any replies. I thought I saw the Duke of Atholl sitting there at his deviled kidneys for breakfast when the maid brought in the post, and he'd open mine and say to the butler, kindly place this in the fire. But to my astonishment, they all replied. I would never have expected that. The only one who didn't reply was the then Lord Macdonald, and I felt a bit annoyed, but a couple of months afterwards I found he died, so I felt that if he was on the point of death when he got my letter, that was a kind of excuse for not writing. But the astonishing thing was that they all assured me, I've got all the letters still in a folder upstairs in the house, called the Landlord's Letters, and there must be nearly 100 of them, and virtually, or the great majority, said no, clearances, no clearances, none around here, I can assure you. And the very few, there were a few who said, well, yes, there were clearances, my ancestors, my forerunners were responsible, and I'm very sorry for it. But almost all of them had sold their clan lands, their Highland lands, and therefore, if there was any kind of comeback for this Highland Clearances, any kind of talk about restoring the land to the people, they would not be concerned. They'd gone down and owned land in Yorkshire or Worcestershire or somewhere. So that was very interesting. But the great majority said no clearances. So, as I say, I've got them upstairs. They were all wrong, of course, and I wrote to, the Duke of Argyll kindly wrote back, and then I wrote to him suggesting one or two things which his ancestors had done, and there was a to and fro correspondence, and finally I went up to the Highlands and called in at all the people I'd been writing to, not all of them, but the Duke of Argyll kindly told his butler or whoever it was to show me his library, and I was very interested to see it. Then I went further north to the Earl of Cromarty, yeah, who very kindly gave me lunch. I remember it was spam with boiled potatoes. Whether he was trying to put me off, I don't know. Or whether that's what earls always have for lunch, I can't tell you. I'm not very conversant with that level of society. But he too let me into his library, and I found some very interesting stuff there, which he wouldn't have been all that pleased for me to see. But I saw a number of them. As I say, I wrote to them all so that if they had any excuse, they could tell me then and there. Since, as I say, the breakwater had been breached by Preble, then everybody was talking about the Highland Clearances, and all this time I was writing. I had to earn my living like everybody else, so I was not doing it full time, but the thousands and thousands of words kept piling up, and in the end, about, 2 or 3 years ago, I reckon that I'd written about 1 3/4 million words, which I'm afraid is a rather long book. If you want to know how long a book is, if you get an ordinary, average, run-of-the-mill novel, it will probably be 70,000, 80,000, 90,000 words. So if you're going up to a 1 3/4 million, you're going past that kind of size of book. So I realized I'd have to break it up into segments, and that's what I did. And we now, with the aid of my publisher, we've now got volume 1 published and volume 3, so I can show you to prove it. Volume 1 was called Clans and Clearance, and that was a kind of a general introduction to the subject. A mere couple of 100,000 words, just something you can read before lunch. So that's the hard cover, and then we've got the soft cover as well, slightly cheaper. There we go. And then obviously it would have been much better to produce volume 2 afterwards, but at a time before I published volume 1, I'd been thinking, I would love to get the Sutherland Clearances out, and that was volume 3. And the Sutherland Clearances was much nearer a publishable state, because when you've written the book, that's only the very first step, almost you could say, because you have to go through it and make sure you haven't spelt the TEH or and DNA or something, and it's amazing what spelling mistakes you can make as you rush through typing on the computer. At least I do. So you have to go through it over and over again, and then since I've been writing bits of it here and there and going back to an earlier stage to put an extra bit in it, sometimes I found that I covered the same subject twice. So there it was on page 50, and blew me, there it was on page 300 again. So you had to go through it and make sure you weren't asking people to pay for when you'd repeated yourself. So all this is called proofreading, and it's much harder than writing the book, in my opinion, much harder. So all this had been done for the Sutherland Clearances, which was volume 3. So we published that, or my publisher kindly published it next. So here it is, the Sutherland Clearances, that was published a month, well, it's only just been published. This is the hardcover, and there it is, and here is the soft cover, again slightly cheaper. I have to say, if you're buying the book, make sure you've done your exercises and built up your muscles, because this is 1.5 kilograms heavy, so you're not going to put it in your pocket and go and look into it going on a country walk. You'll have to have a good solid table. Make sure it is solid, otherwise the table will break, for this to lean on. 1.5 kilograms. How did I find so much out? Other people have written about the Sutherland Clearances. Jim Hunter, for example, has written a book which was about the Sutherland, and it's a very good book too. I'm not attacking it in any way, but it was really only particularly about one Strath Brawler, and one series of clearances, whereas I thought if I was writing about the Sutherland Clearances, I'd have to write about the whole county, not only the counties of Sutherland, who owned a large part of the county, but the Earl of Ray, who owned another big section of it, and all the smaller landlords as well. So I have covered the whole of the Sutherland Clearances. I mean, you may prefer the Jim Hunter approach, in which case fine by him. But if you want to hear the whole, every parish in Sutherland is covered in here, so that when there's one chap, I haven't mentioned him, what's he called? Fry, Malcolm Fry. Where he's appeared from, I've no idea, but he has got a lot of papers and lots of historical journals to publish papers from him in which he says, clearances? What's clearances? Question mark. And then he says, no, there weren't any clearances really. So what he will do when he sees I produced 1.5 kilograms on merely the Sutherland Clearances, I can't think. But to be honest, he hasn't done his homework. For example, he said there was one parish, now which was it? I forget. There's one parish where the Duke of Sutherland owned not an acre, and he's completely wrong, because in fact the Sutherland family owned not only not an acre, but every last acre in the parish was owned by them. So how he could miss that, heaven knows. However, I'm sure he will be buying the book and then writing pages to say, oh dear, I got it all wrong. I don't think. Because of course, if everybody's heard about the Sutherland Clearances, your line is there weren't any. It's interesting. It's like writing a paper to say, Second World War? What Second World War? There wasn't a Second World War. How you can ignore the Highland Clearances when I've written 1 3/4 million words about them? I don't know. But we'll see what his reaction is. I'll send him a copy, to be honest. I'd love to hear from him. Anyway, that is Volume 1 is already out. Volume 3 is just out. The Sutherland Clearances. This is the 1.5 kilograms. So if you or any of your ancestors came from Sutherland, here is, you will find why they came from Sutherland. The numbers of people of Highland descent, there are many more Highlanders living in Canada, the USA, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, around the world, England, than there are in the Highlands now. And the numbers of them who've written in to say, oh dear, I was so interested, I didn't know why my ancestor, my great-grandfather, left the Highlands and went and lived in Carolina. Well, now they will know. But it's marvellous to hear from people who have been able to find out just why their ancestors left the Highlands. So we've got Volume 1 out and Volume 3, and I'm working now on Volume 2. And as soon as I've got the footnotes and the index, my publisher will bring it out. So the first 3 volumes will be there. I'll just tell you, Volume 1 is the general introduction. Volume 2 is the 18th century clearances, which are often ignored. People hear about the 19th century clearances, and there was Sir Moncrief who wrote about them And he said, I've quoted him, in 1801, before the clearances. So poor old Sir Ian never found out about the 18th century clearances. Unfortunately, he's died, so it's too late for me to tell him. But there was 1801 before the clearances, and I've written a whole volume about the clearances before 2001. So if I'm making it up, I must have a very good imagination. So that is volume 2, which will come out shortly. And then volume 4 is the clearances from 1800 to 1840, not including those in Sutherland, which were at that time, 1800 to 1840, volume 4. And then volume 5, 1840 to 1900 clearances, and the Crofters War and all that going through. So each of them, I regret to say, will be just as long as these. If they were shorter, they'd be quicker to get through and produce as published books. But there they are. So if you want to buy any of them, get in touch with my publisher or Amazon. I hope you've enjoyed the video. If you have, I hope you will subscribe, and I hope you will press the notification bell. And by all means, write in to tell us what you think, whether you agree or not. By all means, disagree, and if you do disagree, please give me an indication of where I can get my ideas right again. Thank you.